was asked to speak about today was something that's not exactly fun, all right? And that's research misconduct. And I do have some disclosures, although they are not financial, but it just gives you an idea. And so I thought about this, and I thought, well, you know, if you do human subjects research, you warn people of risks. Well, don't you think it's only fair that if you're coming to a presentation that you should be warned of the risks of coming to this presentation? Yeah, I thought so too. So I brought a picture. This is how you look to me now. Interested, can't wait to learn all you can learn about, right? Do you want to see what you're going to look like in an hour? There you go. Okay. I'm not kidding. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do today is I have 3 objectives. The first objective is to briefly discuss, and we're just going to briefly discuss the United States framework for managing and handling research misconduct. I'm going to review a few select cases, not many, but a few. And if you can't hear me, let me know. Okay. Here. And then we're going to end on examining some strategies that are used to how you detect research misconduct, and it is becoming much easier to detect. So we'll start with the regulatory framework, and handling research misconduct is a very hot issue. And just like there's a common rule in human research protection, there's a government-wide policy that manages and regulates handling research misconduct. And several federal agencies have adopted it. And what they say, if you as an institution want to accept our dollars, you're going to have a policy that complies with this policy. And it gets interesting in terms of one of the first questions that always comes up is, well, what constitutes research misconduct? And the government-wide definition says that research misconduct is defined as fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism. Now look at this closely. In proposing, performing, reviewing, or reporting. So it's not just a matter of publication. Okay? So some people think it's just publication, and in fact, it's much broader than that. The government-wide definition of fabrication is making up data or results and recording or reporting them. Falsification, manipulating research materials, equipment, processes, changing or omitting data. Notice that, changing or omitting data. Some people get in trouble in that. Or results that the research is not accurately represented. And plagiarism is the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. And in this policy, if we receive an allegation, it outlines a possible 5 stages. Now, I'll stress that the regulations do not require that an institution have policies for all of these stages. Okay? So there's a lot of flexibility in how an institution like the University of Kentucky can choose to apply the policy. But first, there's an allegation of assessment. And what happens is if someone calls the office, and I'll show you here at Kentucky who you need to call if you have a concern, initially you have to assess, does it even fit in research misconduct? And I can tell you when I managed this for Kentucky, which I do not anymore, when I managed this for Kentucky, you get a lot of calls about what are potentially alleged unethical behavior in research, all right? But a lot of them don't fit under the government regulation. You know, we get calls on sexual harassment, which maybe it needs to be addressed, but it doesn't fall under this definition of research misconduct. But that's the first stage. Is this something that fits? Oddly enough, authorship disputes do not necessarily fit under the definition of research misconduct. Okay? Now, plagiarism does, but authorship is not immediately something that you, or complaints like, well, I want to be senior author, I should have been senior, or those kinds of complaints could be ethical issues and maybe need to be looked at within the college, but it doesn't fit under this definition. So first it's assessed, then there's something called an inquiry level. And this is required by the federal regulations. And that's sort of a fact-gathering stage. And that's a point where at any institution you can set it up the way you want, who's going to manage the inquiry. But someone looks at the facts and says, is there enough specific information, credible information, for us to do anything with this? And I can tell you right now from experience, sometimes you'll get calls and somebody will say, you know, I know that Michelle's doing something wrong. I know she is, okay? And you need to look into what she's doing. Well, that's not going to get very far with an inquiry. It has to be specific. It has to be specific, because only then, because there's something you can really, it's not a witch hunt. There's got to be some specific thing to look at. The inquiry, as I said, can be managed different ways. And I'm not going to talk today about how Kentucky manages it, but their institutions have lots of choices on how they can manage their inquiry. And if, after they gather their facts, they think that there is enough information to proceed, they go to the serious evaluation, the investigation. And here you're almost always going to have a group of people, usually tenured, with expertise in the area. And this is where it gets very, very serious. Now, I'll go back to inquiry. One thing I would like to stress, when you get an inquiry, if we get an inquiry and you are a subject of the inquiry, so you've got the person that's the subject and you've got the informant who's making the allegation. So if you're the subject, what's going to happen, whoever is the appropriate person at that institution, they're going to walk right in and say, Tammy, we want to see all of your data. We want everything in your computer. We want every paper data you have. We want it, and we want it now. We don't tell Tammy we're coming, but we come in and do it. Now, at this point, Tammy doesn't think we're doing it to help her. Okay? Do you? No. But the reality is, sequestering the data is a very important step because we are helping her. What would be your best defense if you were accused? What's going to be think about that for a minute. Yeah, your data. Your data. And I can tell you there are many times where we went in, we sequestered data, we looked at the complaint, and we found that clearly there wasn't anything to go forward with. So that's actually being done for you. Why would we not tell you? Think about that for a minute. Well, if we tell Paul we're coming back there, and we're going to come, and we collect his data, what does the informant have to say? The informant will say, well, that's not the data I saw. He knew you were coming, so he changed it. You get the picture. So the inquiry stage is where you're gathering lots of facts. But you're not to the point that you're examining all the facts, but you're gathering. And I will say this, if Paul says to me, gosh, I keep my data at home. You know what I'm going to say, Paul? Let's go home. So we want to sequester that data when we come forward for Paul's sake. You understand? It's for Paul's sake. And I think that's a very important thing to remember. Then, if there's enough factual information, at this point they haven't decided whether research misconduct has occurred or not. The question is it warranted to spend the time and the effort and for the sake of the person who's the subject and for the informant to go forward? And once you go forward, it goes to the second stage. And these two stages are federally mandated, and that is the investigation stage. So you set up a committee, okay, and you're going to interview, let me watch my time here, I'll get carried away. You're going to conduct interviews, legal counsel is usually involved. You tell the person's the subject they can get a lawyer too. I mean, there's nothing, actually they're told that at the inquiry stage. But it is closely regulated, everything is documented, they interview, once they start, they may decide they need additional data, maybe from other people on the research team. They may have collected all the data to begin with, but it's an in-depth. And it's during this stage that this group makes a determination on a recommendation. They don't usually, now an institution can set it up like they want to, but they aren't usually the ones that make the final determination. Instead, they usually will make recommendations to the administration to let them make the final determination on what are we going to do and what's going to happen. And in making that determination, and I think this is an important point, the level of proof is preponderance of the evidence. Now think about that for a minute. Preponderance of the evidence. Now when we watch TV shows, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. That's one standard. That's a really high standard. This is preponderance of the evidence. If 51% of the evidence supports the allegations, you can make a finding. So it's not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a much lower standard. The University of Kentucky, you can also, the final, you can have an appeal. A lot of institutions do not have an appeal. It's not federally mandated. Some do. All right? And often the appeals end up in court rather than as part of the administrative process. All right. We have an AR. This is the one that's still in effect. All right? They may change it. I expect a change. It hasn't been changed in a while, and they're always changing. The feds have been putting out more information on research misconduct, but that's our current AR. And this is the person, Dr. Helen Lake Bullock, who's also executive director of the Office of Research Integrity. If you have concerns, this is someone you can call to talk your concerns with. All right. And if there is a case, that office, along with legal counsel, along with the senior administrator or his or her designee at the college level here at Kentucky, would manage the case. I want to stress, Helen will be doing, the VPR has a wonderful new series called Lunch and Learn, and she'll be doing one on November the 13th from 12 to 1 on research misconduct. And she and I talked about this, and I encourage you to go to hers as well. I had shown her these slides before I did them to make sure we weren't overlapping too much, all right? And the regulations keep changing, and as I said, NIH is very interested in this issue. Just a year ago this month, NIH put out a new announcement that reminded institutions, and I didn't totally like this announcement. It says that if an institution finds, learns of, or suspects, I don't like the word suspects. That seems like to me a little early to talk to somebody's NIH program officer. But this just came out because their NIH is so concerned about this issue. And it is very hot. And everybody talks about it. All the federal agencies are concerned about it. And so what I've done is I looked from May 2018 to August 2019, and I didn't look at National Science Foundation, DOD. I only looked at the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Health and Human Services. So this isn't everybody. And looked at what cases had been in the Federal Register. Because if they find that you did commit research misconduct, they put it out in the Federal Register. So it's very public. And I went through it, and what is interesting is I can tell you right now, it's all career levels. It's different career levels, different disciplines, and again, I want to stress this. It can involve progress reports, publications, grant applications, your bio sketch. We want you to really make a good case in your bio sketch, but don't get carried away. Okay, all right? And I can add to that posters, manuscripts, presentations. Any of those there have been findings. Now, I'm not going to go through, you'll be thrilled to hear, all these that I have, and by the way, they did not include a copy of the handouts, but anybody wants a copy of my handouts, if you send me an email, I will send them to you, okay? Vicki?
We'll send one out to anyone who wants.
Oh, that's even better as far as I'm concerned.
Do you want a copy of this?
Yeah, and Vicki, let me give you the PDF. We'll do that. All right. So here we go. And these are sort of interesting. And here we've got a professor. We've got a research interviewer who had 2 published papers, 2 grant projects. These are all people that it was found that the allegations were warranted. I'll point this one out, and I'll give you a warning. This is, if you're a PI working, interviewers are a problem. Okay, in this case, if you look, the interviewer, if I remember correctly, She basically recorded dates for people that didn't exist, provided her own blood samples, okay, and falsely labeled. We've had, in social behavioral, we've had a lot of problems with this. People hire hourly interviewers, send them out, and they'll sit around at home, fill out all the questionnaires and bring them back. So as an investigator, you need to have a system in place.
You got family members.
Yeah, family members. Yeah. Well, we've had that problem too, haven't we, Terry? But this is something that, as an investigator, you need to be thinking about. You know, because research misconduct happens at all levels, and if you're a supervisor, it's something that you really need to think about. Okay, this one I thought was interesting because it's a PhD thesis, a poster presentation, and, dear mentors, a mentor's grant application. So if you're a mentor, if you have graduate students, you need to be thinking about how can I ensure this isn't happening on my watch, all right? Here's a former research associate. Here's a professor. We've got an eminent scholar. Most of these say former eminent scholar. Former this. This one was plagiarism. You don't see as much with plagiarism because everybody knows that everyone's checking for plagiarism now. But you notice that this one was for plagiarizing 40% of the specific aims, 50%. One big problem that NIH is putting a lot out on now is peer review integrity and how important it is because they had some problems with peer reviewers utilizing grants that they used. This was a former student, former project scientist. You keep going. This one was published papers and posters. Staff scientist, acting assistant professor, former professor of medicine, okay, 2 grant applications you notice. This was, and notice that so many different disciplines. This was a visiting fellow. Okay. What do you think about that? You know what I think about it? I think it's shocking. I seriously, I think it is absolutely shocking. And I'm going to show you a list that you don't want to be on, okay? This is that. But every year they put out top science scandals. This is scandals. This is 2012. It's not a list you want to be on. Look closely. What university was this from? What university was this from? University of Kentucky, that's right. Our office managed it. We actually ended up doing 2 inquiries, 2 investigations, and it took us 3 years. Okay? It was a very long haul. In it, Eric Smart was accused of falsified and fabricated over 10 years, 45 figures, 10 papers, 1 manuscript, 7 applications, and 3 progress reports. Now, I'll tell you, I like Eric Smart. Now, not everybody did, but I did. I liked Eric Smart. He was on my institutional animal care and use committee. So I had a lot of dealings with him. He was a really tough reviewer. He was on a lot of our training grants. Okay. And if Eric walked in here right now, he would tell you he didn't do it. He may, if you look through the examples I gave you, some people admit, and they're disqualified from receiving NIH funds. Some people are still disqualified, but they never admit whether they did it or not. Well, in his case, all right, he never admitted he did it. He claimed he didn't do it. Certainly, by preponderance of the evidence, it was clear he did. There were indications and a lot of knockout mice models, and they never existed here at the University of Kentucky. We absolutely could prove that, and yet we saw it time and time again. And you can say to me, how could somebody get away with it? Well, first of all, it was basic science, and at that point, there wasn't this push on replication, all right? So often there wasn't replication or rigor like there is now in terms of replicating. There were a series of different chairs in that department. He was an associate dean of research in that department. department. And there were a series of chairs. All right, so they came in. Here was this great guy who had all these publications, all these NIH grants, and his management style. And again, remember, we sequester everything. And if you looked at the management style, some people share and manage labs a certain way. Well, in his case, everything was siloed and everything came to him. Okay? And so over time, we were based on the preponderance of the preponderance of the evidence. It looked pretty clear who had done it. I don't enjoy research misconduct. It's no win for anybody. It's really no win for anybody. You know, and it raises questions. How far back do you? What about the co-authors? Sometimes it can have a significant impact on the co-authors, depending on what you find when you begin to sequester your data. Sometimes when you sequester your data, there isn't any indication that a co-author, in terms of where the problems were and what the problem was involved at all. Okay? But I can tell you what happened to our co-authors with Eric is that when they went then to publish the grants where they retracted the articles, the journal said, you had an article retracted because of research misconduct. You cannot submit any more papers to our journal. People were, you know, but in this case, given how that was handled, we were able to go back to the journals and said, you know, we looked, we did investigations, we looked, there's no evidence it was anyone but the individual that was the subject of the allegation. But it comes in. And imagine how that impacted the people in the lab, impacted other training grants. So it makes me so sad when, in fact, an allegation comes in, and even more so if we should find that it was supported. Now, it's too bad. Today is not a day where we can be interactive, but I wish we could. Because I want you to start thinking, why on earth do people do this? Just run it over in your head. Now, I had several cases when I was still doing this, and I can tell you, I agree with them. You know, they think they know the answer. Now, that sounds crazy, doesn't it? I can tell you we had someone here, it was found to be warranted, and the primary response was, I knew my hypothesis was correct, and we'd done something wrong with the data. And I thought this was genuine. I mean, I believe that. So it just kept, you know, you can tweak data, but you can't change data dramatically so that you're changing complete outcome. And there was, but he kept saying, I don't think I did anything wrong. I know the data had to be wrong. We made mistakes. Well, pressure, career, again, basic scientists, and people think I will not get caught. And I'm sure some people don't get caught. Okay? Although I'll show you in a minute how it's getting easier. There is, and I've put the reference, I'll show you the reference in a minute, but the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Research Integrity has put out a lot of infographics. And I'm going to talk about them in a minute, but they're very useful. But one of the things they stress, look up there, what are some of the reasons? Poor supervision, inadequate training. Now, if there was poor supervision, like if Vicki had, we're not going to hold her accountable. We're going to hold accountable the individual who did it. But those of you that are in positions to provide training and to be supervisors, your papers are going to be retracted if they're on there. I mean, it impacts you too. And so I think this is very important, and I want to circle back in a minute to talk about responsible conduct and research training. Now, what can you do to protect yourself? I mean, we've gotten, when I was doing this, we got a lot of allegations. We didn't have many that went all the way to investigation, but we had lots of allegations. So what can you do to protect yourself? And I can give you some advice, which everybody will sit there, and this is so mom and apple pie. Pie, you can see I'm from Western Kentucky, pie, mom and apple pie, that you'll think, well, that sounds great. I'm already doing it, or you're thinking, who's got time to do it? And that's the problem. You got to take the time to think about these issues and set up systems. And people just simply feel like they don't. And I get that. If I had time, I could go around here and I'd say, well, tell me, let's see, what you got kids, you're taking care of your parents, you're advising, you got a real job, you start looking at all the hats you wear, you're writing grants, you're trying to get your publications out. Who's got time to do this? I can tell you it will change your career if you don't take time to do this, even if it's just somebody that works in your lab or works as a coordinator in your system. So you've got to take the time to look at it. I will warn you, it's very important to have clear-cut authorship and ownership. Who owns it? And who, because we got so many calls from people who were, they were upset about the authorship issue, okay? And if you're the senior person, you have an obligation to make it clear in writing what your expectations are and who can be an author and who can't. If you're a junior person, and now because of the power differential, it gets harder, doesn't it? But if you're a junior person, as much as possible, you need to be finding out in this research team, what does it take to be an author? So that you won't be surprised later. You know what the expectations are. And anytime you can get things in writing, it is better. It's so important to train yourself and the people that you're working with and your staff and your students. Guys, I know I'm not supposed to move. Brian said I can't move because this is being taped. But I will tell you, documentation, document. Do it right. Know how to do a lab. Know how to do when you're clinical research. But you all, clinical research that's overseen by FDA generally knows what you've got to do. But if you don't and you have any doubts and you need to see a sample of how it's doing right, try to find it, because I can't tell you how many times that actually saves people. You got to set up procedures and then double check to see if you're following them. And all of this, think how much time this takes. And oversight, assess, look at raw data. Look at raw data. And again, this sounds bad, it takes time. But have a system set up so that periodically, if you're the person in charge, you're looking at raw data. If you're working with a colleague, it gets a little bit harder. So if I'm working with somebody powerful on a research study, it's a little bit hard for me to say, well, can I see your raw data? Right? But do everything you can to look at what's really happening and learn. And guys, I wish they'd give me a half a day, give me a year, because begin to understand and identify when there's an ethical issue or a regulatory issue. And I can give you some examples of things that didn't come up to the research misconduct level, but you're faced every day with ethical issues, and maybe you got to learn to recognize. I had to learn that. You know, as an administrator, I suddenly realized one day that I was regulatory for CCTS and director of the IRB office, and I knew they were doing audits here, and yet, so I had to work out a way to ethically to be sure that what I knew here fit with what was required to be here, right? So you have to learn. It is, and I give you a perfect example, and this is not a research misconduct, but it is certainly a good example of identifying either an ethical or regulatory issue. We had an investigator who had a well-funded and had developed a special relationship with a number of subject population cohorts. It was really, really well done. Keeps getting funding, working with this group, collected health information, collect social security numbers, etc. And he had a great graduate student. And one Friday, the graduate student came in, and this was like, this guy was really good. And the PI had worked with him a long time. And the guy said, I didn't get the analysis done. Would you care if I took it home? Now, PI says, Friday afternoon, 5 o'clock, he really wants that data analyzed. He's not thinking about ethics and regs, is he? He's thinking about getting that data analyzed. And he made the decision to say, well, you know how important this is. Will you please take it home and take good care of it? Well, right there, he had an ethical and regulatory decision. Now, what happened is the kid left it in his truck, not for very long, but did. The truck was broken in. All the cohort data was stolen. He had to go back to his cohorts, who then started dropping out from a study after he had worked years to establish these relationships. And it was just a little decision. I mean, the graduate student just didn't take it. But you've got to learn to recognize ethical and regulatory decisions. And it's hard to do because you're not thinking about it. But try to recognize it because it really makes a difference. And in terms of training people, I brought some resources. And these are resources that might help you navigate through responsible conduct and research, okay? Here we go. That's the way my husband looks like when I'm driving, and I'm not kidding, okay? That's the way my husband looks like when I'm driving, all right? But I'm not going to run through these, but I can tell you there is so much there. Your problem is you don't have time to find it. So let me help you, okay? I love these infographics that HHS has put out. They're single pages. They have tips. So you're working with a group of students, all right, or with colleagues. You can get one. You say once a month, we're going to talk about one of these. You put it out, or you put it up in the lab, or you put it up, where the coordinator, you use these, like tips for preparing, for presenting, tips for ethical writing. Look at these. I'm not going to go through them, but they're really useful. They're short, they're quick, they don't require any real preparation, but you start talking and thinking about these issues on an ongoing basis. And I can't tell you how important that is. And there's lots of these. 6 lapses in judgment. The labs. Anybody here ever use lab to train your students? I'll tell you what this is. It's cool. Have you used it?
Didn't we do this on the ethics course?
Yeah, I've used it. And it's a little long. That's the only problem. But there's one for clinical and one for social behavioral. I guess that's not clinical. I guess one for basic science and one for social behavioral. But it's pretty cool because you go in. Now, the acting is not great. Let me mislead you, all right? And you go in and the person taking it can make choices. And depending on the choices you make, depends where you end up at the end. Okay? And I know some people have based whole courses on it because, they'll go through it and it's pretty interesting. And they got real life situations, like in the lab, one of the guys, his wife's pregnant, she's screaming at him to come home, right? It's 2 o'clock in the morning. Don't you love me, honey? All you care about is that damn lab. But you have to understand that there are real live issues that come in play when people are beginning to make some decisions, ethical decisions that are not the wisest. But I really like these. We do have National Science Foundation requires, and so does NIH actually, but NIH's is different. National Science Foundation requires that there be some kind of training if you have funding, and we use CITI. What NIH does, what I like even better, it says, well, you can use CITI, but you also have to have face-to-face contact with senior people or middle-level people. And I like that better than just CITI. But there's lots and lots of resources out there. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about is detecting research misconduct. And I think there are 3 reasons why now it is so much easier. First of all, it's easier to actually do research misconduct. But it's also much easier to identify. 1, there are readily available tools. 2, journal oversight. The journals are very interested in this issue. 3, the self-policing. The research community is not happy about research misconduct. And they're using the social media to talk about what they think is happening. Now, we'll start with the tools. And I love this article. It's one of my favorites. It came out in 2004. Think how much has changed since 2004. And what it said is, hey, it's pretty easy to manipulate an image. It's pretty easy, and here we need to think about what are the ethical processes, and here's the standards you should be thinking if you're cropping, if you're enhancing, if you're cloning, your contrast and brightness. How do you do it ethically? And it wasn't too long began to be developed forensic tools. These are all public. You can get your hands on them, where you can use them. And a friend of mine we call him a RIO, that's the Research Integrity Officer, like Helen Lake Bullock is now. And, like, so what happened, I know in one case it's like, these are all public. So somebody took 3 different articles that were published in 3 different journals by the same research group and said something doesn't look right, and they just stuck some images through these tools and was able to prove that it was actually the same image, even though the articles claimed they were different images, right? It was the same image that had just been manipulated, and then they sent it to the Office of Research Integrity at the National Institutes of Health, who then turned around and went to the institution. So there's just so many tools to choose from now. That Infographic, they've got a misconduct quiz where reviewers can test their ability to detect research misconduct. Again, that's something else you might could play with if you were teaching it. Possible flags. Old-fashioned tools come in play. And this interests me. And there was a graduate student who was trying to replicate her experiment. She tried, and she tried, and she tried, and finally she became convinced somebody was sabotaging. So she went to the principal investigator and said, I think somebody's sabotaging. And the principal investigator said, no way. I don't believe it. There's just absolutely no way. And he said, but look, I can tell you, I've got this is the old-fashioned way. I've got security I got videos, surveillance just for security. Now, nobody in the lab knew he had it, but he did. So he just watched it, and guess what? The postdoc was going in the middle of the night, taking her experiment out of the refrigerator, and was sabotaging. And then Nature, the journal Nature, got it through Freedom of Information, and at one time I watched it. I could watch the video. This guy goes in. I forgot, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, I forgot, takes it out, what he does. Isn't that amazing? So that's the old-fashioned way, but there are lots of ways to get caught. And that leads us to the second reason I think it's so much easier to detect research misconduct now. Journals. Journals say, we're tired of this. We're tired of getting retractions. We're tired of people. And they are really looking at it closely. There was an article that came out last November saying that just about all the main journals were hiring what they call integrity czars. And all these people do is sit around trying to make sure that what is in the articles, in fact, is accurate and was not fabricated or falsified or plagiarized. Lots of plagiarization tools. Everybody wants to say. By the way, can you plagiarize yourself? Yes. Yeah, you can. If you don't give yourself a reference, then you've already published. Yes, you can. But plagiarism always gave me a little bit of trouble, and I'll tell you why. If you're doing a research method, how many ways can you describe that research method differently? I mean, you can't. And so sometimes that bothers me. I sort of like what National Science Foundation does and all these federal agencies sort of play. They really, in plagiarism, puts focus on how serious and how important it is. So they wouldn't look so much at methods, but if you were plagiarizing hypotheses, or making up past data. I mean, plagiarism is one that always sort of gave me trouble, but the journals are all over looking at it. All the journals now have standards that they expect for you to meet if you're submitting there. You'd be wise to read these standards before you submit your publication. I mean, that's a good idea. Third area is social media. And it's not so much the social media, it's that the scientific community is beginning to police itself more aggressively. And one website that's really had an impact is something called the Retraction Watch. Anybody here ever go to the Retraction Watch? Okay. Yeah, I do, occasionally, just for fun, nothing else to do in my life, right? Let's read the retraction. But basically, and I've heard the guy speak 2 or 3 times. You ought to have him, we might have him come in and speak sometime here. He's sort of interesting, but because he didn't need to mean to make a career out of this, but it is now. And anybody that retracts in major articles, major journals, he posts it. Author, country, journal, subject, and type. And then people who have a lot more time than a lot of you have just sort of go and blog about it. And they start taking this stuff and put it in tools, right? And looking. And they'll start before anybody else knows talking about who might have done what. It's not always correct. We had somebody here who came to me and said, I'm in the correction watch, and I want you to know. You know, and we looked. They had done nothing wrong. It was a legitimate retraction that had nothing to do with research misconduct. And then you have to deal with what do you do with all these people blogging, right? So it's not a completely positive thing, but it's an interesting thing. This is one. I picked this one just because this is clinical sponsored. But I mean, this person went to jail. But look at what this person did. Swapped patient stool samples of his own, pocketed the money, earmarked for patients, forged patient records, lab work, and doctor's signature, created 15 to 20 fictional patients. Scary, isn't it? Particularly if that data is taken seriously. Okay? The next one I'm going to show you, which is the most amazing, and I have to give Helen credit for showing me this. This whistleblower uses YouTube. Now, I hope this plays. I got my fingers crossed. We will see. He put it up on, he's accusing people of research misconduct on YouTube. Put music to it. And he has, I think I've forgotten, 19 images. And then he started doing it with journals here in the United States. Isn't that amazing? So, what can I say? Let's see if I can move on here. But so I do think in today's world, it's much easier to detect research misconduct than it was in the past. And so that sort of leads me to wanting to conclude on a quote that I think is very important. And Donna Shalala said this, and ever since I have agreed with it. Her quote was, our ethics must be as good as our science. Okay? Our ethics must be as good as our science. And think about that. If you're going to do research in this current ethical, legal, regulatory environment, your ethics needs to be as good as your science. And I can't emphasize. So my purpose today was threefold. I wanted to give you a brief overview of the U.S. framework, discuss a few select example cases, and talk about strategies.